My name is Dana Brooks. I'm 38 years old, and 3 Thursdays ago my Uncle Grant called a family meeting to explain why my grandmother needed to stay in the cheapest room at Pine Hollow. He said her savings were almost gone. Then he placed a memory care brochure in front of her and asked the rest of us to support a guardianship petition. Grandma Ruth sat beside me with both hearing aids dead. Grant looked at her and said, "She can't even follow this conversation." I reached into my purse, took out a silver charging case he didn't know I had, and set it on the table. The light turned green. What Ruth said after she could hear him ended his control of her money before lunch. Before I tell you how we reached that table, ask yourself one thing. If an older person seems confused only when one relative is in charge, would you trust the relative or check the batteries? Let me know where you draw that line. I learned mine in a place that smelled like boiled cabbage, lemon cleaner, and wet wool. Pine Hollow residents sat near the edge of Boise, behind a tire shop and a strip mall. The sign out front showed mountains and blue sky. The lobby showed neither. It had brown carpet, plastic flowers, and a television mounted so high that everyone watched with their chins lifted. Pine Hollow wasn't dangerous. That mattered. It was licensed, clean enough, and always short-staffed. It was the kind of place families chose when money was tight. Ruth's money wasn't tight. I visited on a Sunday in late November. Rain tapped the windows, and the heat in Ruth's room had quit again. She wore her winter coat over a cotton nightgown. Her lunch tray sat untouched by the bed. A gray piece of chicken leaned against mashed potatoes with a skin on top. I said her name twice. She didn't turn. When I touched her shoulder, she jumped so hard that the water in her cup spilled. "It's me," I said. "Dana." Ruth studied my mouth. Then she pointed to her ears. Her hearing aids were in place, but the tiny status lights were dark. I found the charger in the top drawer under a stack of washcloths. The cord was missing. On the lid, someone had put a white label in Grant's block handwriting. "Office use only." Ruth had worn hearing aids for 6 years. She knew how to clean them, charge them, and change the wax guards. She also balanced her own checkbook until the month Grant moved her into Pine Hollow. Yet the staff notes on her door said, "Resident becomes disoriented during financial conversations." The sentence bothered me. It was too specific. It didn't say mornings, evenings, or after medication. It said financial conversations. I found a spare cord at the nurse's station and charged the case while I warmed Ruth's hands between mine. After 20 minutes, she put the hearing aids back in. Her face changed at once. The room seemed to return to her. She looked at the tray and said, "They've served that chicken 3 times this week." Then she looked at the label on the charger. "Your uncle says I lose the cord." "Do you?" I asked. Ruth's eyebrows rose. That was the look she had given me when I was 12 and blamed the dog for a broken lamp. "I lost one earring in 1998, she said. "Grant has been living off that story ever since." She took my wrist. Her fingers were cool, but her grip was steady. "Charge them. Come alone Tuesday." I was a physical therapist at a rehabilitation clinic across town. Most of my patients were older adults recovering from falls, joint replacements, or strokes. I knew how quickly hearing loss could be mistaken for confusion. I also knew that cognition couldn't be judged while someone was struggling to hear the question. Grant knew what I did for a living. He still expected me to accept the note on the door. Ruth was my mother's mother. My mom, Elaine, died from ovarian cancer when I was 26. After that, Ruth became the person who remembered both my childhood and my adulthood. She had taught me to drive in an empty church parking lot. She had sat through my physical therapy school graduation in shoes that pinched. When my marriage ended, she mailed me a grocery gift card and a note that said, "Eat first, decide later." Ruth never confused care with control. Grant was different. He was Ruth's only son and my mother's younger brother. He sold commercial roofing for most of his life and could make a request sound like a favor he was doing for you. He remembered birthdays when other people were watching. He brought expensive pie to Thanksgiving and left before the dishes. When Ruth's husband died, Grant began handling small things. First the property tax, then the insurance, then the bank statements. 2 years before the meeting, Ruth fell on her back steps and fractured her wrist. Grant appeared at the hospital with a legal pad, 3 pens, and a plan. He said she needed someone to pay bills during rehabilitation. Ruth signed a durable financial power of attorney naming him. It wasn't a guardianship. It didn't erase her rights. It let him act for her when she wanted help. Grant treated it like a transfer of ownership. At first, the arrangement seemed practical. Ruth completed rehabilitation and returned to her bungalow. Grant set up automatic payments and brought groceries on Saturdays. I visited after work and handled her exercises. We joked that she had a finance department and a therapy department. Then Grant's son, Tyler, opened Cedar Ridge Outdoor, a small company that built cedar planters and patio benches. The company needed cash. Ruth's life began getting cheaper. The changes came one at a time. Grant canceled the woman who cleaned Ruth's house twice a month. He switched her supplemental insurance to a plan with a narrower network. He told her the roof repair could wait. When she asked why, he said markets were uncertain and older people had to be careful. Ruth had a pension, Social Security, and more than $300,000 in savings. Careful did not mean cold rooms and delayed repairs. Then Ruth fell again. This time she bruised her hip but broke nothing. Grant said the house was no longer safe. I agreed that she needed support for a while. I didn't agree with Pine Hollow. I toured River Glen, a smaller assisted living community near the Greenbelt. It had consistent staffing, physical therapy space, and hearing support in the dining room. Ruth could afford it. Grant refused. "A bed is a bed," he told me in the hospital cafeteria. "She doesn't need a hotel." He stirred powdered creamer into his coffee and never looked up. "Tyler is building a future. We can't burn through family money on fancy curtains." I remember the exact words because they made something inside me go still. Ruth's money had become family money. Ruth's care had become burning through it. I pushed back. Grant smiled the way he did when a customer questioned a warranty. He said Pine Hollow was temporary. He said he wanted to see how much help Ruth truly needed. He said River Glen had a waiting list. Only the last statement was true. Pine Hollow admitted her 3 days later, and temporary became 11 months. During those months, I visited twice a week when work allowed. Ruth complained about the food, the broken heat, and a shower aide who rushed her. She never complained about memory. Grant told everyone she repeated herself. I noticed she repeated things when her hearing aids were dead. That happened most often after his visits. On Tuesday, I left work early and returned alone. Ruth was waiting in the small library near the laundry room. She had chosen a table where the dryer noise covered our voices. Her hearing aids were charged. The silver case sat between us like a tiny metal witness. She slid me a folded grocery receipt. On the back, in blue ink, she had written, "Grant moved my money to Tyler. He thinks I don't know." I asked how she knew. Ruth told me Grant had taken a bank call in her room. He believed her hearing aids were dead. One had enough charge left for her to catch the words business account and another transfer. She pretended not to hear. The next week, she asked for a statement. Grant brought her a summary page with no transaction history. That was when she began watching him instead of arguing. "Why didn't you call me?" I asked. Ruth tapped the charging case. "With what?" Grant had replaced her old cell phone with a basic model and removed the banking app. He told staff that financial calls upset her. He had also changed the mailing address on her accounts to his home. None of those acts alone proved theft. Together, they formed a room with no doors. Ruth opened her purse and removed a checkbook register. She had kept it hidden inside a knitting bag. The last balance she wrote herself was from the month before Pine Hollow. It was far higher than the amount Grant claimed remained. She had also listed every gift she remembered giving Tyler. One entry stood alone, $12,000 for startup tools. That was a gift, she said. I signed the check. Nothing after that was mine. I asked what she wanted, not what she feared, not what she thought the family would tolerate. What did she want? Ruth answered without pausing. She wanted to see every transaction. She wanted Grant removed from her accounts if he had taken more. She wanted to move to River Glen when a room opened. Most of all, she wanted him to stop using her hearing loss as proof that she had lost her mind. I need you to understand something, she said. I may need help walking, I may need help hearing. That doesn't make my money his. Her voice was low and even. I believed her. I also knew belief wasn't enough. If we accused Grant without records, he would call me emotional and call Ruth confused. He had already built that story. We needed facts that belonged to Ruth, not to me. The next morning, I called an elder law attorney named Melissa Park. I had met her once through a patient's family. I described the situation without using Grant's name. Melissa asked whether Ruth could explain her assets, her relationships, and the consequences of changing financial agents. I said yes. She told me the next step was simple. Ruth needed private legal advice and direct access to her own records. Melissa didn't promise a dramatic rescue. She said a power of attorney did not make Grant the owner of Ruth's money. It also did not prevent Ruth from acting for herself while she remained competent. Ruth could request statements, revoke his authority, and demand an accounting. If the records showed misuse, recovery would be a separate question. I liked Melissa immediately because she didn't sell certainty where none existed. We arranged a meeting at Pine Hollow for Friday morning. Grant usually visited in the afternoon. Ruth asked the front desk not to notify him. The receptionist hesitated because Grant was listed as the primary contact. Ruth leaned forward and said, "Primary contact is not primary person." The receptionist flushed, then booked the private dining room. Melissa arrived carrying a slim laptop and a yellow legal pad. No dramatic briefcase, no stack of forms. She spent almost an hour alone with Ruth before inviting me in. She asked Ruth to explain the power of attorney in her own words. Ruth did. She named her bank, her approximate savings, her monthly income, and the gift to Tyler. She also explained why she no longer trusted Grant. After the meeting, Melissa told me Ruth had been clear and consistent. She recommended an independent cognitive evaluation because Grant had already raised concerns, not to prove that Ruth was perfect. Nobody is. The goal was to show that hearing loss and occasional word finding were not the same as incapacity. Ruth agreed. "Test whatever you like," she said. "Just let me hear the questions." I scheduled appointments with her audiologist and a geriatric specialist. The audiologist adjusted her hearing aids and documented that she understood normal conversation when they were charged. The specialist spent 2 visits with her. Ruth missed the exact date by 1 day and remembered every major financial fact. The written conclusion said she could understand and direct her own financial and care decisions. Grant learned about the appointments from the facility calendar. He called me before I reached the parking lot. "Why are you dragging her all over town?" he asked. I could hear traffic behind him. "Because she asked me to," he laughed once. She asks for things she forgets 5 minutes later. I looked through the windshield at Ruth, who was folding the appointment summary into her purse. "Then, why are you afraid of what she remembers?" His tone changed. Grant said I was creating conflict at the worst possible time. Cedar Ridge had a large order pending. Tyler employed 6 people. The family needed stability. I asked what Tyler's company had to do with Ruth's medical appointments. Grant went silent for 2 beats. Then he said, "You always make everything sound ugly." He ended the call. That sentence stayed with me. I wasn't making it ugly. I was removing the cover he had placed over it. The ugly part was already there. It was in the dead hearing aids, the missing statements, and the coat Ruth wore indoors because the cheaper room had unreliable heat. The bank visit happened the following Monday. Ruth carried her driver's license, social security card, and the old checkbook register. I brought the silver charging case and a portable battery pack. We sat with a branch manager named Lee in a glass office near the lobby. Ruth asked for 2 years of complete statements and a list of every person authorized to act on her accounts. Lee verified Ruth's identity and asked whether she wanted me present. Ruth said yes. That small question mattered. It was the first time in months that someone had asked Ruth who she wanted in the room. Lee printed the authorization record. Grant's power of attorney was on file. No one else had access. Then she printed the transaction history. The first transfer to Cedar Ridge Outdoor appeared 6 weeks after Ruth entered Pine Hollow. It was labeled as a family loan. The next came a month later, then another. Some were round amounts. Others matched equipment invoices. Over 11 months, the total reached $86,000. Ruth pressed one finger under the final figure. "I gave Tyler 12, she said. Grant took the rest." There were also monthly payments to Grant for care management. Ruth had never agreed to pay him. The amount wasn't huge compared with the transfers, but it cut differently. Grant had paid himself for choosing cheaper food, fewer services, and a room with failing heat. He had turned neglect into a billable task. Lee couldn't decide whether Grant had broken the law. She could tell us what the records showed. The money had left Ruth's accounts through transactions authorized under the power of attorney. Several transfers went directly to Cedar Ridge. 2 went to Grant first, then moved out the same day. The bank would accept a written revocation whenever Ruth chose to provide one. Ruth did not revoke Grant's authority that day. That surprised me. She wanted to know where the money had gone and whether Tyler knew. Melissa agreed that waiting a short time was reasonable if the bank watched for unusual activity. Lee added an alert and gave Ruth a direct number. We left with statements sealed in a plain white envelope. Ruth held them against her coat all the way to the car. At lunch, she ordered tomato soup and half a turkey sandwich. She ate 3 bites before speaking. "Your mother would have walked into Grant's office and thrown the bowl." I laughed despite myself. Elaine had loved a clean confrontation. Ruth smiled, then grew serious. "I don't want noise. I want him unable to explain it away." That was Ruth's strength. She didn't confuse speed with courage. Grant had spent nearly a year making her smaller in other people's eyes. She wanted the full shape of what he had done. We began with the care records. Pine Hollow gave Ruth copies because they were hers. The pages showed every service Grant had declined in her name. He had refused weekly transportation to the senior center. He had cut physical therapy after 4 visits. He had declined a private hearing consultation at the facility because it was not medically necessary. He chose the least expensive meal plan and removed laundry assistance after claiming Ruth preferred independence. Ruth could fold clothes. She could not carry a basket safely with a walker. The records also showed that staff had reported missing charging cords 3 times. Each report followed a Grant visit. One aide wrote that Grant took the case home to clean it. Another noted that he asked staff to keep the charger in the medication room because Ruth was obsessing over calls. The charger wasn't medication. It was access to language. I spoke with the aide who wrote the second note. Her name was Marisol. She was careful. She wouldn't accuse Grant of anything, and I didn't ask her to. She said Ruth was engaged when she could hear. She joined trivia, remembered staff names, and corrected the television weather report. On days without charged hearing aids, she withdrew and nodded. Grant called the nodding confusion. "Did he ever ask you not to charge them?" I asked. Marisol looked toward the hall. "He said too much stimulation made her anxious." She paused. She didn't seem anxious. She seemed shut out. That statement was not a legal conclusion. It was an observation. Melissa told us to keep it that way. On Thursday, Grant arrived during my visit. He filled the doorway in a navy rain jacket and looked from me to the bank envelope on Ruth's table. His smile vanished. "What's that?" Ruth placed her hand over the envelope. "Mine." Grant stepped inside and shut the door. "Mom, Dana is upsetting you." Ruth touched the silver case. The light was green. "I can hear you," she said. Grant stopped. It was the first time I saw him understand that her silence had not been emptiness. He recovered quickly. "Good. Then you can hear me say I'm trying to protect you." Ruth asked from what? He answered, "From spending every dollar because a nicer place has a garden." "And Cedar Ridge?" I asked. Grant turned toward me. "Tyler's company is family." I said Ruth was family. His jaw moved before the words came. "A bed is a bed. Tyler is building a future." There it was again. His rule. Ruth's remaining years counted as storage. Tyler's business counted as life. Ruth asked whether Tyler knew the money came from her savings. Grant avoided her eyes. He said Tyler knew the family had invested. Ruth asked who had authorized more than the original gift. Grant told her they had discussed it after her fall. She said, "You discussed it. I was in pain medication and asked you to pay the electric bill." Grant lifted both hands. "This is exactly why I stepped in. Your memory shifts." Ruth named the hospital, the nurse who witnessed the power of attorney, and the amount of the electric bill. Then she named the date Grant moved her statements to his house. He looked at me instead. "You coached her." That accusation hurt more than I expected. Not because it was true, because it revealed what he thought of Ruth. Any clear thought had to belong to someone else. Any refusal was manipulation. Any agreement with him was proof of competence. Grant had built a system where Ruth could be considered rational only when she surrendered. I told him we had requested a formal accounting through Melissa. He said he would provide one. He called the transfers loans and the care payments reimbursement. I asked where the loan agreement was. He said families didn't need paperwork for everything. Ruth tapped the bank envelope. "You needed paperwork when you took my authority," she said. "You just didn't want it when you took my money." Grant left without saying goodbye. 10 minutes later, my phone filled with messages from relatives. My aunt said I was humiliating him. A cousin said Tyler's employees had children. Another asked whether Ruth truly needed an expensive place at her age. None of them asked why Grant had transferred $86,000 without her clear consent. My father called that evening. He and my mother had divorced when I was a teenager, but he remained friendly with Grant. Dad said Grant had always carried the family's practical burdens. I asked whether practical people got to pay themselves from an older woman's account. He sighed. "I'm saying there may be context." Context became the family's favorite word. It meant Grant's reasons mattered more than Ruth's permission. It meant Tyler's risk mattered more than Ruth's cold room. It meant everyone could avoid choosing a side while the money kept moving in one direction. I wanted to tell them all to go to hell. Instead, I wrote one response. "Ruth is competent. The accounts are hers. She has requested records. Please stop discussing her as if she is already gone." Then I turned off my phone and drove back to Pine Hollow. Ruth was in the common room watching a game show with captions. Her hearing aids were charging beside her. She had heard about the messages because Grant had called the front desk and demanded that staff limit my visits. The administrator refused. Ruth grinned when she told me, "He forgot I pay the rent." That line became our first small victory. Pine Hollow updated the care plan to state that Ruth directed her own visitors and decisions. Grant remained the financial agent for the moment, but he was not allowed to restrict contact. The administrator also assigned staff to charge the hearing aids every night. I bought a second silver case and kept it in my purse. The extra case changed Ruth's days. She returned to trivia. She argued about baseball with a retired mechanic named Owen. She called me from the hallway phone and complained that the coffee tasted like roof water. Her mind had not returned. it had never left. The people around her could finally reach it. A week later, Melissa received Grant's accounting. It was 12 pages of categories with almost no receipts. The transfers to Cedar Ridge appeared under Family Asset Preservation. His payments appeared under Care Coordination. The phrase made Ruth laugh until she coughed. "He coordinated me right out of my own life," she said. The accounting did reveal something new. Cedar Ridge was in worse shape than we knew. The company owed suppliers, had missed rent, and had pledged equipment against another loan. Grant had used Ruth's money to keep it alive through the winter. He hadn't made one bad decision. He had made the same decision every month and called repetition necessity. Melissa asked whether Ruth wanted to revoke the power now. Ruth said not yet. She wanted Tyler in the room when Grant explained. Melissa warned her that delay carried risk. Ruth understood. She instructed the bank not to allow any transfer above a modest amount without direct confirmation. That was not a freeze. It was a safeguard Ruth chose for her own account. Then River Glen called. A studio would open in 6 weeks. The room faced a courtyard with raised garden beds. Ruth could afford the deposit and monthly fees if the transfer stopped. The deadline was 10 business days. If we missed it, the room would go to the next person on the list. That deadline focused everything. Grant had argued for months that River Glen was an indulgence. Now Ruth had 10 business days to protect the money that would pay for it. The room was not a fantasy anymore. It had a number, a window, and a move-in date. I called Tyler the next morning. We had never been close, but we weren't enemies. He was 7 years younger than me and had spent most family gatherings following Grant from room to room. Tyler answered from his workshop. Saws whined behind him. When I asked whether he could meet Ruth privately, he said, "Dad told me not to talk to you." "I'm not asking for your father's permission." I told him the amount transferred from Ruth's accounts. The workshop noise seemed to drop away. Tyler said the company had received investments, but Grant had described them as money Ruth wanted the family to use. He knew about the first gift. He did not know the full total. I couldn't tell whether he was shocked or calculating. Tyler asked to see the statements. I said Ruth would decide what he saw. He came to Pine Hollow that evening. Grant did not know. Ruth chose the small patio even though it was cold. She wanted open air and no doors Grant could close. Tyler sat across from her, with his work jacket zipped to his chin. Ruth showed him the original check register. "I gave you $12,000, she said. Tyler nodded. "Dad said you wanted to invest more." Ruth asked whether Grant ever put her on a call, sent her an agreement, or told her the business could not repay. Tyler looked down at his boots. No. He admitted Grant had deposited money whenever payroll was short. Sometimes Tyler asked where it came from. Grant said he had arranged family financing. Tyler wanted to believe him. That part was obvious. Wanting to believe was not the same as knowing nothing, but it wasn't the same as planning the theft either. "Did you spend it?" Ruth asked. Tyler said yes. The answer came out thin. He explained that most of it went to rent, lumber, and wages. Ruth said, "Then the money is gone whether you meant to steal it or not." Tyler flinched. Grant had protected him from that sentence. Ruth did not. Tyler offered to sign a repayment note. Ruth told him not to offer what the company could not do. She asked for honest numbers. He said Cedar Ridge might survive one more quarter if a hotel contract closed. Without new money, it would likely shrink or close. Ruth listened. Then she said, "A business that needs my bath money is already smaller than you think." I watched Tyler absorb that. Ruth wasn't talking about luxury. Pine Hollow charged extra for assisted showers. Grant had declined the service after the first month. I had been coming early on Saturdays to help because Ruth was afraid of falling. The money keeping Cedar Ridge open had purchased lumber, while Ruth waited for her granddaughter to wash her hair. Tyler began to cry, not loudly. He covered his eyes with one hand and bent forward. I felt sympathy, but I didn't rescue him from the truth. Ruth didn't either. After a while, she asked whether he would attend the family meeting Grant was planning. Tyler looked up. What meeting? That was how we learned Grant had been moving faster. He had called several relatives and said Ruth's condition had worsened. He wanted a family council to support moving her into a secured memory wing. He also wanted to sell her bungalow before Dana drained the estate on premium care. The meeting was set for the following Thursday, the same day Ruth's River Glen deposit was due. Grant had turned the deadline into a trap. If he convinced enough people that Ruth lacked capacity, he could use their support to frighten her and delay the move. A family vote had no legal power over Ruth, but social pressure had power. So did confusion. Grant understood both. Melissa told us not to overreact. A guardianship petition would require evidence and court review. A family meeting could not declare Ruth incompetent. The house also belonged to Ruth, and the power of attorney did not let Grant ignore his duty to act for her benefit. Still, Melissa advised Ruth to revoke his authority before the meeting, not during it. Ruth hesitated. She had imagined looking Grant in the eye as she signed. Melissa asked whether that moment was worth the risk of another transfer or a rushed property contract. Ruth considered it for nearly a minute. Then she said, "No. I want the result more than the performance." That was the moment I understood who was leading us. We scheduled the revocation for Wednesday morning. Ruth also chose a professional fiduciary named Helen Wade to handle investments and bill payments. She did not choose me. I was relieved. I wanted to be her granddaughter, not the next relative accused of treating her account like a family drawer. My role would be care representative and emergency contact. I could speak with facilities and doctors, but I could not move her money. Ruth liked that division. Grant thought love and access were the same thing, she said. Let's prove they are. Before Wednesday, we needed a complete record of the $86,000. Tyler brought us Cedar Ridge's bank ledger. He had printed it at the workshop after Grant left. The deposits matched Ruth's statements. The ledger also showed that Grant had described himself as the source of 2 large infusions. Tyler had thanked his father for risking his retirement. Grant accepted the thanks. That detail changed Tyler's posture. Until then, he had been ashamed of benefiting. Now he was angry about being lied to. Grant had not merely taken Ruth's money, he had used it to play the generous father. Every time Tyler said thank you, Grant stood on money that belonged to someone else. Tyler wanted to confront him immediately. Ruth refused. "He'll prepare," she said. Tyler argued that Grant deserved warning. Ruth looked at him for a long moment. He had 11 months of warnings every time he opened my account. Tyler stopped asking. The next days were the hardest part. Grant visited Pine Hollow twice and acted tender. He brought Ruth a poinsettia. He asked whether her room was warm. He sat near her bed and spoke too slowly, stretching each word as if volume could replace respect. Ruth let him. Her second charging case was hidden in my purse. The first case sat empty in the medication room, exactly where Grant expected. After one visit, I asked how she endured it. Ruth said she was listening for what he believed he could still get. Grant had asked about the bungalow's insurance, the location of the deed, and whether she remembered signing any new forms. He did not ask how her hip felt. He did not ask why she had started attending trivia again. "He notices documents," she said. "He doesn't notice me." The sentence wasn't dramatic when Ruth said it. She was brushing crumbs from her lap. That made it worse. She had spent months learning how little of her personhood Grant needed in order to manage her life. I drove to her bungalow the following Saturday with Ruth's key and written permission. Grant had been collecting the mail. The house smelled closed. Dust lay over the piano and the framed photographs. In the kitchen, I found notices from River Glen that had been opened and left in a drawer. One was dated 4 months earlier. Ruth had been offered a room before. Grant never told her. I called Ruth from the kitchen. She was silent after I read the date. Then she asked me to check the hall closet. Her good winter coat was gone, so was a small jewelry box. We later learned Grant had moved both to his house for safekeeping. He returned them when Melissa sent a written request. The objects mattered less than the habit. Grant believed possession made his choices reasonable. On the refrigerator, Ruth still had my mother's recipe for peach cobbler held by a red magnet. I stood there longer than I needed to. Elaine would have seen Grant sooner. Or maybe she wouldn't. Families teach us which selfishness to call personality. Grant had been practical for so long that no one noticed when practical became profitable. I gathered the River Glen letters and photographed where I found them. I did not search Grant's things or take anything that belonged to him. The house was Ruth's. The letters were addressed to Ruth. Melissa was strict about those lines. We were protecting Ruth's choices, not giving ourselves permission to cross new boundaries. Grant called while I was locking the front door. A camera over the garage had alerted him. "Why are you in Mom's house?" he demanded. I said Ruth had sent me. He said he managed the property. I asked where the first River Glen offer had gone. The silence told me he knew exactly which drawer I had opened. "That place would bleed her dry," he said. I reminded him that Cedar Ridge had taken $86,000. Grant's breath hit the phone. "Tyler will pay it back." I asked when. He said after the hotel contract. I asked whether there was a signed contract. He called me cruel. Cruel was another useful word. It made every request for proof sound like an attack. Grant said I wanted Tyler to fail. I said I wanted Ruth to stop financing a business she had not chosen to own. He replied, "You don't understand what it means to build something." I looked at the bungalow Ruth and her husband had paid for over 30 years. "I understand who paid," I said. Grant warned me that Thursday's meeting would settle the issue. He had spoken with a lawyer about guardianship. He had relatives ready to describe Ruth's decline. He said a judge would see that I had manipulated a vulnerable woman. The threat landed. I knew enough to understand that false claims could still cost time, money, and peace. After the call, I sat in my car with both hands on the steering wheel. Rain moved over the windshield in slow sheets. For the first time, I wondered whether helping Ruth would make her final years more stressful. Grant had built his advantage from that fear. He counted on decent people choosing calm over conflict while he kept the account. I called Melissa. She didn't tell me not to worry. She said Grant could file whatever he chose, but Ruth's recent evaluation, direct instructions, and consistent financial knowledge mattered. She also reminded me that avoiding conflict was not neutral if the transfers continued. "Stress is already here," she said. "The question is who controls it." That night, Ruth called from the hallway phone. Her hearing aids were charged. She asked whether I was scared. I said yes. She said, "Good, fear means you're looking at the whole thing." Then she told me to sleep. "I'm not asking you to save me from a life I don't understand. I'm asking you to help me protect the life I do." Wednesday morning arrived clear and painfully bright. I picked Ruth up before breakfast. She wore navy slacks, a cream sweater, and the pearl earrings she thought she had lost until Grant returned the jewelry box. The silver charging case rested in her coat pocket. She checked the green light twice before we left. At Melissa's office, Ruth read every page of the revocation. The document ended Grant's authority immediately. A second document appointed Helen as financial agent. Ruth signed both in front of the required witnesses. No one clapped, no music played. Melissa made copies, and Ruth tucked one into her purse beside the charger. We went straight to the bank. Lee met us in the same glass office. She reviewed the revocation, updated the account, canceled Grant's access, and helped Ruth move the remaining funds into accounts he had never managed. The process took less than an hour. 11 months of control ended with Ruth's signature and a branch stamp. Helen joined us by video and confirmed the new arrangement. Bills would be paid from Ruth's account. Any payment outside the routine budget would require Ruth's direction and Helen's record. Dana, the granddaughter, could not withdraw $1. Grant, the son, could not either. The wall protected Ruth from both of us. Ruth paid the River Glen deposit before we left the bank. The studio was hers. The deadline from the cold opening and the family meeting now pointed to the same day, but Grant no longer controlled the answer. He believed Thursday would decide where Ruth lived. Ruth had already decided. Melissa sent Grant notice of the revocation that afternoon. She also sent a formal demand for receipts and repayment discussions. Grant received the email at 4:16. At 4:19, he called me. I did not answer. At 4:22, he called Ruth. Pine Hollow put the call through because Ruth asked them to. I sat beside her while she listened. Grant's voice carried through the receiver. He said she had made a terrible mistake. He said outsiders would drain her with fees. He said Dana had turned her against her own son. Ruth waited until he stopped. "Come tomorrow," she said. "Bring Tyler, bring your papers, I'll bring my hearing." Then she hung up. Grant called 7 more times. Ruth declined each call. She ate dinner in the common room and won trivia by naming all 4 Beatles. That detail mattered to me because ordinary life continued. Ruth was not a courtroom exhibit. She was a woman who wanted better soup, a safe shower, and a chance to hear the question before someone answered for her. Thursday morning, Pine Hollow's administrator, Karen Mills, asked whether Ruth wanted the meeting canceled. Ruth said no. She wanted the facility to hear her instructions directly. Karen reserved the conference room and agreed to document the updated contacts. Melissa would not attend. She had done the legal work. The family truth belonged to us. Tyler arrived first. He looked as if he had not slept. He carried a thin folder containing Cedar Ridge's current balance sheet and a signed statement that the company would not accept more money from Ruth. Ruth read it and placed it beside the silver case. "That's a start," she said. Grant arrived with my father and Aunt Beverly. He had invited them as witnesses to Ruth's decline. He also brought a memory care brochure, a draft letter supporting guardianship, and a printed estimate for selling Ruth's bungalow. The papers formed 3 neat stacks. Grant always looked most confident when a table belonged to him. Ruth sat at the far end beside me. Her hearing aids were in, but Grant didn't know about the second charger. He glanced at the old case Karen had brought from the medication room. Its light was dark. He relaxed. That small movement told me more than any speech. He expected her not to hear. Karen closed the door. Rain had started again, soft against the narrow window. Grant thanked everyone for coming and said the family faced a painful decision. He spoke toward my father, not toward Ruth. Mom's condition has advanced. Dana's interference has made it harder to keep her safe. Ruth's fingers touched my sleeve. That was our signal. I took the silver case from my purse and placed it in front of her. The green light faced Grant. Ruth adjusted both hearing aids. Then she said, "Start over. This time, say it where I can hear you." Grant stared at the case. "Where did that come from?" I said it belonged to Ruth. He asked why staff had allowed me to bring unauthorized equipment. Karen answered that Ruth was allowed to use her own hearing devices. Grant looked at Karen as if she had broken rank. The room shifted before the real argument even began. He tried again. He said Ruth had become forgetful, suspicious, and vulnerable to influence. He held up the memory care brochure. The secured wing had fewer exits, closer monitoring, and a lower monthly rate than River Glen. "This isn't punishment," he said. "It's responsible planning." Ruth asked what danger the locked doors would prevent. Grant said wandering. She had never wandered. My father cleared his throat and said Grant had mentioned missed medications. Karen checked Ruth's care notes. There were no missed medications. Aunt Beverly said Ruth had forgotten her birthday call. Ruth named Beverly's birthday, her husband's middle name, and the restaurant where they had celebrated the year before. Beverly lowered her eyes. Grant pushed the guardianship letter toward us. Memory comes and goes, that's the problem. Ruth read the first paragraph. It described her as unable to understand basic financial matters. She placed the page flat. "How much is in my checking account?" she asked. Grant said that wasn't relevant. Ruth gave the amount within a few dollars. "How much did you send Cedar Ridge?" she asked. Grant's face tightened. He said the business transfers were separate from the care discussion. Ruth turned to Tyler. "How much?" Tyler swallowed. $86,000. My father looked at Grant. Aunt Beverly whispered, "That can't be right." Grant said the money was a family investment. He said Ruth had always supported Tyler. Ruth opened her old check register and showed the original gift. $12,000, signed by me, written by me, remembered by me. Then she pointed to the bank statements. "Everything after that was you." He leaned toward her. "You agreed after the fall." Ruth didn't raise her voice. She named the day, the hospital room, and the reason she signed the power of attorney. "I asked you to pay my bills while my wrist healed. I did not ask you to turn my old age into your son's credit line." Grant looked at me. "This language is Dana's." That was his last shelter. If Ruth sounded strong, I had written her. If she sounded tired, she was incompetent. I said, "You don't get to call every sentence hers when she agrees with you and mine when she doesn't." He slapped one hand on the table. "I kept this family afloat." Tyler spoke before anyone else could. "No, you kept my company afloat with her money and let me thank you for it." Grant told him to stay out of adult matters. Tyler laughed once, without humor. "You put my name on every transfer. I'm already in it." The room went quiet. Grant turned back to Ruth and softened his voice. He said Cedar Ridge employed people. He said one difficult winter could destroy years of work. He said the money would return after the hotel contract. Ruth asked whether the contract was signed. Tyler said no. Grant's patience broke. "What was I supposed to do, let my son fail while you spend twice as much on a room with flower beds?" There it was, not confusion, not emergency. A choice. Ruth's comfort was waste. Tyler's risk was destiny. Grant had decided that her money owed the future more than it owed her. He picked up the River Glen estimate. "A bed is a bed. Tyler is building a future." The words landed exactly as they had in the hospital cafeteria. I had waited months to answer them. "A bed is where she has to live," I said. "Tyler's business was where you chose to gamble. You didn't stretch her money. You spent her care on your son." Grant called me self-righteous. He said I had no children and could not understand what a parent would do to protect one. I told him parenthood did not turn another person's account into rescue money. Then I slid Pine Hollow's service records across the table. They showed the showers, therapy, transportation, and hearing support he had declined. "You paid yourself for care coordination," I said. "This is what you coordinated." I pointed to the discontinued services one by one. Grant said Ruth refused help. Karen corrected him. The records showed that he had declined the services as financial agent. Ruth had asked for several of them later. Marisol's note was next. It documented the charger removed after Grant's visit. The audiologist's report followed. It said Ruth understood conversation when her hearing devices worked. The geriatric evaluation said she could direct her own care and finances. No single page proved everything. Together, they destroyed the story Grant had built. Grant scanned the table. "Doctors can be fooled." Melissa had warned us he might say that. Ruth was ready. "Then ask me," she said. "Ask where I live. Ask what I own. Ask who you are. Ask what you took." Grant did not ask a single question. Instead, he reached for the draft house estimate. He said the bungalow had to be sold to preserve what remained. Ruth opened her purse and removed the stamped revocation. She handed him a copy. "You don't manage the house. You don't manage the account. You don't manage me." Grant read the first line twice. Color rose from his collar. He asked when she had signed it. Ruth said yesterday. He looked at me and demanded to know what I had done. I said, I drove her to the appointments she chose. She did the rest. He pulled out his phone and opened the banking app. His thumb moved across the screen. The login failed. He tried again. This time, the app displayed a message telling him to contact the account owner. That message was the immediate consequence he could not debate. His access was gone. Karen updated the contact sheet while he watched. Helen became the financial contact. I became the care contact. Grant's name moved to the ordinary family list with no authority to direct staff or restrict visits. Karen asked Ruth whether she wanted him removed from the building. Ruth said not yet. I want him to hear the rest. Tyler placed his signed statement on top of the bank records. He said Cedar Ridge would stop operating at its current size. He would sell unused equipment, end the showroom lease, and work with Helen on repayment. Grant snapped that Tyler was destroying his future. Tyler answered, it was never mine if she had to lose hers. That sentence hit Grant harder than anything I had said. He had justified every transfer as fatherly love. Now his son refused the gift. Grant told Tyler he was ungrateful. Tyler said he was ashamed. The difference mattered. Gratitude would have protected Grant. Shame forced the truth into the open. Ruth took the River Glen agreement from her purse. The deposit had been paid. The studio would be ready in 5 weeks. She handed Karen the move-out notice. I signed as the delivery witness, exactly as Ruth had asked. That was my irreversible action. I was not taking control of her life. I was helping carry out the decision Grant had tried to erase. Grant looked around the table for support. My father studied the service records. Aunt Beverly held the bank statement with both hands. Neither defended him. Grant said families handled mistakes privately. Ruth answered, you made it private by making sure I couldn't hear. He tried one final time. He said he had been overwhelmed after Ruth's falls. He said he feared the money would vanish on care and leave nothing for the next generation. Ruth's face softened, but her boundary did not. You were allowed to be afraid, she said. You were not allowed to make me disappear. Ruth then gave him 2 choices. He could work through Helen and Melissa on a documented repayment plan, or Melissa would pursue recovery and report the transactions for formal review. She did not promise he would avoid consequences. She gave him a path that required records, not trust. Grant asked whether she was cutting him off as a son. Ruth said no. She was cutting him off as an owner. Visits would happen only if he respected her hearing devices, her care plan, and her decisions. No financial talk without Helen present. No removing property. No speaking about her, as if she were not in the room. The meeting ended without shouting. Grant gathered his brochure and guardianship letter. He left the house estimate on the table. At the door, he looked back at the silver charging case. The light was still green. For nearly a year, he had mistaken silence for surrender. Now he knew the difference. The immediate aftermath was less dramatic and more useful. Grant did not return to Pine Hollow that week. Helen paid the River Glen balance from Ruth's protected account and reviewed every recurring bill. She canceled the care management payments to Grant. She also found 2 subscriptions he had added for Cedar Ridge and removed them. Tyler closed the showroom before the end of the month. He kept 2 employees and moved the remaining work into a shared shop. The hotel contract never came. He sold a commercial saw, a delivery trailer, and several finished pieces. The first repayment went to Ruth's account 6 weeks after the meeting. It was not enough to erase the loss. It was proof that the loss belonged to him and Grant, not to her. Grant signed a repayment agreement after Melissa made clear that vague promises were over. He sold a recreational vehicle and used part of the proceeds for the first larger payment. He still insisted he had acted for the family. Ruth stopped arguing with that sentence. Boundaries did what arguments could not. They made his opinion irrelevant to her access and care. My father apologized to Ruth for arriving as Grant's witness without checking the facts. Aunt Beverly apologized too. Ruth accepted both apologies and told them that apology did not restore authority. They could visit, they could call, they could not vote on her life. Neither argued. 5 weeks later, I helped Ruth move to River Glen. The studio was small, but sunlight reached the carpet. Her window faced 3 raised garden beds and a row of young maple trees. The bathroom had grab bars in the right places. The dining room used a hearing loop that sent sound directly to her devices. At the first lunch, she heard the woman across from her without asking her to repeat. At Pine Hollow, every request had passed through Grant before it reached Ruth. At River Glen, the receptionist looked at Ruth first and waited for her answer. That ordinary pause felt more expensive than any chandelier. Ruth chose her own curtains. They were yellow, not fancy. She added a blue chair from the bungalow and my mother's recipe card under the red magnet on a small refrigerator. We brought the piano bench, though there was no room for the piano. Ruth said a home could hold memory without holding every object. Grant visited once during the first month. Helen was present because he wanted to discuss repayment. He brought no poinsettia and no forms. Before sitting down, he asked Ruth whether her hearing aids were working. She said yes. It was a small question, years overdue. He did not apologize in the clean way I hoped he would. Grant said he had panicked, believed in Tyler, and made choices he thought he could repair later. Ruth told him that repair began with naming the damage. He could not do that yet. She ended the visit after 20 minutes. The next one would depend on whether he followed the agreement. Some relatives thought Ruth was too hard. Others thought she should have reported Grant immediately and never spoken to him again. Ruth listened to both sides and chose neither. She wanted repayment, distance, and control. Forgiveness was not a facility package someone else could select for her. My relationship with Ruth changed too. I stopped checking whether she needed me every hour. I had been so focused on protecting her that I sometimes hovered. She noticed. One afternoon, she told me to go home because she had bridge at 4 and did not need a chaperone. I went. Protecting someone's choices includes the choice not to perform gratitude for your help. At work, I began asking a new question when older patients seemed withdrawn. Could they hear us? It sounds obvious. It should be obvious. Yet I had watched an entire family interpret silence as permission because checking the battery would have complicated the story they preferred. If someone you love needs help, ask what they want before deciding what they are worth. And if a relative controls the money, make sure another person can still hear the conversation. Tell me whether Ruth was right to leave a narrow door open for Grant, or whether you would have closed it completely. Ruth turned 80 in the spring. She invited 8 people to lunch at River Glen. Grant was not there. Tyler came early and carried in a peach cobbler made from Elaine's recipe. It sank in the middle, and Ruth told him so. He laughed. Then he handed Helen another repayment check without making a speech. After lunch, Ruth and I walked through the courtyard. She used her walker and stopped at every planter. The first tulips had opened along the south wall. On the bench beside her sat the silver charging case. Its green light glowed in the sun. For months, that light had meant evidence. Then it meant access. By spring, it meant something simpler. Ruth could hear the birds, the scrape of my shoes, and the question I asked her. She could answer for herself. This time, everyone listened.